It was supposed to be an ordinary weekend road trip, just me and my 3 best friends escaping the usual grind for some fresh mountain air. Rachel had it all planned out, as she usually did. Her texts over the past week were filled with hiking trails, photos of perfect campfire spots, and local roadside diners she insisted we had to try. This time, she promised, we'd be taking the scenic route. We all met at dawn, each of us lugging backpacks stuffed with gear and enough snacks to last a week. Marcus, always practical and ready for anything, had stocked his truck with blankets, emergency kits, and his giant flashlight, which he boasted could light up an entire valley. Lily, more reserved but no less adventurous, quietly double-checked her own camping equipment and stashed an extra battery pack for her phone. She was the cautious one, often noticing things the rest of us missed. Rachel's excitement was contagious as we piled into Marcus's truck. "This'll be a trip to remember," she said, her eyes gleaming. She had found a small town nestled in the Colorado mountains called Black Hollow, and had convinced us to stop there first. "Trust me," she'd said, "Black Hollow is the place for some epic views and real local flavor." The drive was smooth at first, winding roads through pine trees and occasional glimpses of mountain peaks. We laughed, talked about college, and shared playlists as the miles ticked by. But as we neared Black Hollow, the mood began to change. The road narrowed, and the trees seemed to close in, thick and shadowed, blotting out the sun. "What's with this road?" Marcus asked, gripping the wheel a bit tighter. "Feels like we're the only ones out here." "No worries," Rachel said, leaning forward between the front seats. "That's part of the charm, right? Uncharted territory." But it was more than just empty wilderness. As we drove through the outskirts of town, I noticed how quiet it was. There were a few houses scattered along the road, their windows dark and empty, but no signs of people. It was strange, eerie even. I felt a prickling at the back of my neck, and judging by Lily's uneasy glances out the window, I wasn't the only one. Finally, we reached Black Hollow's main street. It was the kind of place that looked like it hadn't changed in 50 years, narrow sidewalks, faded storefronts, and a gas station with a single pump. As we parked, I noticed a handful of locals watching us from across the street. They weren't smiling, they just stared, as if we were intruding. "Friendly bunch," I muttered. Rachel waved off my concern. "They're just not used to visitors, that's all." She jumped out of the truck, camera in hand, ready to document every moment. We wandered into the town's only diner. The place was dimly lit, its booths worn and covered in faded vinyl. A bell rang as we entered, and a woman behind the counter looked up, her face expressionless. She nodded toward an empty booth, her eyes lingering a little too long on each of us as we passed. I slid into the booth next to Marcus, trying to shake off the growing unease. The woman brought over menus without saying a word, her gaze drifting between us as if she were sizing us up. "See?" Rachel said with a grin, oblivious to the tension. "This is authentic." Marcus rolled his eyes but humored her, ordering coffee and a burger. The rest of us followed suit, though none of us were particularly hungry. I glanced around, noticing how quiet the place was. There were other people here, locals, but they all sat with their heads down, speaking in hushed tones. "Maybe it's just me," Lily whispered, leaning close, "but it feels like they're watching us." Before I could respond, the diner door creaked open, and an elderly man walked in, his clothes worn and dusty. He glanced around the room, then walked straight over to our table, stopping right next to me. His eyes were sharp and oddly intense, piercing into mine with an unnerving familiarity. "You kids ain't from around here, are ya?" he asked, his voice raspy. "No, sir," I replied, trying to keep my tone friendly. "Just passing through." He nodded slowly, his gaze shifting from one of us to the next. "People come and go through Black Hollow. But not everyone makes it out." He smiled, a grim, unsettling expression. "Just be sure you don't linger too long." With that, he turned and shuffled away, leaving a chill in his wake. I looked at my friends, each of them wearing the same uneasy expression. Rachel laughed nervously, brushing it off. "It's just small-town superstition," she said, though her voice lacked its usual confidence. We finished our food quickly, the uncomfortable atmosphere finally pushing us to leave. As we stepped outside, I noticed that the locals were still watching, their eyes following us as we walked back to the truck. Marcus climbed into the driver's seat, muttering, "Well, that was weird. Let's get out of here." As he started the engine, I glanced out the window, catching one last look at the diner. The elderly man was standing just inside, watching us through the glass, a strange look on his face, almost as if he were relieved. We pulled out of Black Hollow, but something felt off. I could still feel the weight of those stairs, lingering in the back of my mind. "Let's set up camp soon," Rachel said, breaking the silence. "There's a spot not too far from here. Should be perfect." But as we drove, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being followed. I kept looking back, half expecting to see someone, a shadow, a face, something, trailing behind us. The road stretched ahead, winding into the darkening trees, and a strange unease settled over me. Just before we reached the camping site, I glanced back one last time, and that's when I saw it. A car, barely visible in the distance, following us. I blinked, hoping I was imagining it, but when I looked again, it was still there, a dark silhouette against the fading light. Guys?" I said, my voice tight. "I think we've got company." Marcus checked the rearview mirror, frowning. "Maybe they're just heading the same way." But as we pulled off onto the narrow dirt path toward the campsite, the car followed, its headlights dim but unmistakably there, watching, waiting. Rachel leaned forward, her excitement dampened by the growing sense of danger. "Let's just get to the campsite. Maybe they'll pass." We parked, and the car slowed, stopping a few hundred feet away. No one got out. They just sat there, their headlights piercing through the trees, casting eerie shadows that seemed to move, shifting in the fading light. A chill ran down my spine. We hadn't even started our trip, and already, something felt terribly wrong. We sat around the campfire that night, trying to pretend everything was normal, but the tension hung thick in the air. No one could shake the image of that car parked a few hundred feet away, its headlights casting long, eerie shadows between the trees. No one had stepped out of the vehicle, and its lights eventually turned off, leaving us with nothing but darkness and unanswered questions. Rachel, ever the optimist, was the first to break the silence. "Maybe they're just locals on a late-night drive," she said, trying to brush it off, though her eyes flicked nervously in the direction of the car. "I mean, who knows? Maybe it's normal for them to park around here." "Normal?" Marcus scoffed, tossing a stick into the fire. "Nothing about this is normal. And something about that guy back in town," he trailed off, shaking his head. "The way he warned us. It's like he knew something we didn't." Lily glanced over her shoulder, her expression tense. "I feel like we're being watched. Like, right now." A shiver ran down my spine, and I instinctively looked around, peering into the shadows cast by the flickering firelight. The trees stood tall and silent, but there was a heaviness in the air, a stillness that felt wrong. "Look, let's just call it a night," I suggested, trying to keep my voice steady. "We'll get some rest, pack up early, and get out of here before dawn." Everyone agreed, and soon we were zipping ourselves into our sleeping bags, each of us facing a different direction, as if keeping watch from all sides. The fire crackled softly, casting dim light on the tents, but as the night deepened, that eerie silence returned, wrapping around us like a thick fog. I was just beginning to drift off when I heard it, a faint rustling in the trees. I froze, my pulse quickening, straining to hear past the thumping of my own heartbeat. The sound grew louder, footsteps crunching on dried leaves, moving slowly, deliberately. I turned to see if the others were awake, only to find Lily staring back at me, her eyes wide with fear. She raised a finger to her lips, signaling for silence. The footsteps drew closer, stopping just outside our campsite. In the dim light, I could make out a shadowy figure standing a few feet away, just at the edge of the trees. The figure was tall, motionless, its features obscured by the darkness. Who's there?" Rachel whispered, her voice trembling as she peeked out of her tent. The figure didn't respond. It just stood there, watching us, its form blending into the shadows like a ghost. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, it turned and disappeared into the trees, its footsteps fading into the night. "Did everyone else see that?" Marcus whispered, his voice low and tense. "Yeah," I replied, my heart pounding. "We need to leave. Now." We scrambled out of our tents, quickly gathering our things. But as we packed, a strange feeling washed over me, an inexplicable pull, like something was keeping me rooted to the spot. I looked up, catching a glimpse of movement in the trees. More shadows, figures moving quietly, watching us. There wasn't just one person in the woods. There were several. "Hurry," I urged, my voice barely above a whisper. We finished packing and made our way back to Marcus's truck, glancing over our shoulders every few steps. The figures stayed just out of sight, shadowy forms flitting between the trees, watching, waiting. As we climbed into the truck, Marcus fumbled with the keys, his hands shaking. He finally managed to start the engine, and we tore out of there, the tires kicking up dirt as we sped down the narrow road. We drove in silence for a few minutes, each of us lost in our own thoughts, the weight of what we'd seen pressing down on us. But the sense of unease only grew. It felt like we were being followed, even though I couldn't see anything in the rearview mirror. Rachel broke the silence, her voice shaky. "Do you guys feel that? Like we're not alone?" "Yeah," Marcus muttered, gripping the wheel tightly. "Like they're still watching us." I peered out the window, my eyes scanning the dark trees as we drove. I didn't see anything, but I could feel it, that sense of eyes on us, tracking our every move. The road twisted and turned, leading us deeper into the forest, and with each mile, the feeling intensified. Just as we were beginning to think we'd left them behind, Marcus slammed on the brakes, skidding to a stop in the middle of the road. "What's wrong?" Lily asked, panic creeping into her voice. Marcus stared straight ahead, his face pale. "Look." We followed his gaze and saw it, a figure standing in the middle of the road, illuminated by the truck's headlights. It was the same figure from the campsite, tall and shadowed, its face hidden in darkness. But now, it was joined by others, 4, 5, 6 figures standing behind it, all watching us, their eyes reflecting the headlights like the glint of a predator's gaze. "Go!" I shouted, my voice breaking. Marcus threw the truck into reverse, backing up until he could turn around. We sped down the road in the opposite direction, the headlights casting eerie shadows that seemed to stretch and twist around us. I kept glancing back, expecting to see the figures chasing after us, but there was nothing. After what felt like an eternity, we reached a small clearing and pulled over, each of us struggling to catch our breath. "What the hell was that?" Rachel whispered, her face pale. "People from the town?" I suggested, though even as I said it, I didn't believe it. There was something wrong about those figures, something that didn't feel human. "Whatever they are," Marcus said, his voice shaking, "we need to find a way out of here. This road should lead us back to the main highway." But as we turned back onto the road, I noticed something strange. The trees looked different, twisted and gnarled, their branches stretching out like skeletal arms. The road, which should have led us back the way we came, seemed unfamiliar, as if it were leading us somewhere else entirely. "Are you sure this is the right way?" Lily asked, her voice laced with fear. Marcus nodded, but there was uncertainty in his eyes. "It has to be." We didn't take any turns. We drove in silence, the road stretching endlessly ahead, each mile feeling like we were sinking deeper into a trap. The feeling of being watched never left, like invisible eyes were tracking us from the shadows. Then, up ahead, we saw it, a sign barely visible in the dim light of the headlights. As we got closer, the words came into focus, and a chill ran down my spine. "Welcome to Black Hollow." We had somehow come full circle. That's impossible," Marcus stammered, his knuckles white as he gripped the steering wheel. "But here we are," I whispered, dread pooling in my stomach. "It's like we never left." The town was just as empty and silent as it had been before, but now it felt different, darker. The streetlights flickered as we drove past, casting long shadows that seemed to reach out, pulling us back into Black Hollow's grip. "We need to get out of here," Lily said, her voice barely above a whisper. "This place, it's not right." We kept driving, passing the diner where the elderly man had warned us earlier. I half expected to see him there, watching us from the window, but it was empty. The whole town felt abandoned, like a ghost town left to rot. And that's when I saw it, a figure standing in the distance, at the edge of town, watching us with that same piercing gaze. "Just keep driving," I murmured, unable to look away. "We'll find a way out." But as we drove, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were exactly where we were supposed to be. That no matter how fast we went, no matter how many turns we took, Black Hollow wouldn't let us go. The weight of the silence was crushing as we drove slowly through Black Hollow, the headlights casting an eerie glow on the deserted streets. It was as if the town had swallowed all sound, all life, leaving only shadows and the sensation that we were not alone. The same cold feeling ran through me, like I was walking into a trap I couldn't see. We parked in front of the gas station. It looked just as we had left it, but now, in the dead of night, it felt even more unsettling. We stepped out of the truck, each of us glancing over our shoulders, half expecting someone, or something, to step out from the shadows. "Maybe we should just ask for directions," Rachel suggested, but her voice trembled, betraying her own unease. "Ask who?" Marcus replied, scanning the dark, empty windows of the shops. "There's no one here." He was right. The town felt abandoned, yet there was a lingering presence, a feeling that someone, or something, was watching us, waiting for us to make the wrong move. Lily moved closer to me, her gaze fixed on the gas station. "There's a light on inside," she whispered, nodding toward the dim glow seeping through the station's single dusty window. I took a deep breath and stepped toward the door, pushing it open with a creak. The inside was cramped, cluttered with shelves of dusty goods and outdated magazines. At the counter stood an old man, the same one who had spoken to us in the diner. His face was impassive, almost as if he had been waiting for us to return. He didn't acknowledge our presence, he simply looked up, his piercing eyes landing on each of us in turn. Finally, he spoke. "You kids didn't heed my warning," he said, his voice as dry and hollow as the wind. "Black Hollow doesn't take kindly to visitors who don't know when to leave." "Look, we're just trying to get out of here," Marcus replied, the frustration and fear clear in his voice. "The road led us back to town, and we can't seem to find a way out." The old man's expression didn't change. "Once you step into Black Hollow, it remembers you. It'll make sure you stay." A chill ran through me, and I glanced at Rachel and Lily, both of whom looked just as unsettled. "What do you mean, it remembers us?" I asked, hoping for some kind of explanation, even if it was a wild one. He simply looked at me, his eyes devoid of warmth. "Every few years, strangers like you stumble in. They think they're just passing through. But this town, it holds on to people. It always has." "What happens to them?" Lily whispered, her voice barely audible. The old man didn't answer right away. Instead, he stared out the window, as if lost in thought. "Some try to run," he finally said. "Others try to hide. But Black Hollow has a way of finding them. Of making sure they never leave." "That's insane," Marcus muttered, though his voice lacked conviction. The old man looked back at us, his gaze piercing. "You don't believe me? Then try to leave." But don't say I didn't warn you." Without another word, he turned and shuffled into the back room, leaving us standing there, alone in the dim light. The silence pressed down on us, heavy and suffocating. "Let's get out of here," I said, feeling the urge to leave that place as quickly as possible. We piled back into the truck, but as Marcus turned the key in the ignition, the engine sputtered and died. He tried again, but the truck wouldn't start. Panic rose in my chest as he tried over and over, each attempt met with the same, eerie silence. "This can't be happening," he muttered, pounding his fist on the steering wheel. "We have a full tank, everything was fine earlier." "It's the town," Lily said, her voice shaking. "It's keeping us here." Rachel shot her a nervous glance. "Come on, that's just superstition. There's a logical explanation for this. Maybe it's the engine, or maybe that man was right," I interrupted, a chill creeping down my spine. "Maybe this place really is alive." Silence fell over us, each of us grappling with the fear growing in our minds. We were trapped, in a town that seemed to defy logic, a town that didn't want us to leave. Eventually, Marcus sighed, running a hand through his hair. "All right, let's go back to the gas station. Maybe the old man can help us figure this out." Reluctantly, we climbed out of the truck and headed back toward the gas station. But when we got there, the place was empty. The lights were off, and the door was locked. It was as if the man had never been there at all. This doesn't make any sense," Rachel said, her voice barely above a whisper. I peered through the dusty window, but there was no sign of the old man, or anyone else for that matter. The entire place looked abandoned, untouched, as if no one had set foot inside for years. Lily grabbed my arm, her face pale. "We need to get out of here. Now." Just as she spoke, a loud crash echoed down the empty street, coming from somewhere behind us. We spun around, our hearts racing, but there was nothing there, only the empty buildings and the shadows stretching across the ground. "What was that?" Marcus whispered, his voice barely audible. I strained to listen, but the town was silent once more. Too silent. The kind of silence that makes your skin crawl, that fills you with a primal fear you can't explain. "We should leave," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "There has to be another way out of town. Maybe we can find a back road, or—" Before I could finish, the shadows at the edge of the street began to move. Figures emerged from the darkness, stepping slowly into the faint light of the street lamps. There were dozens of them, their faces hidden in shadow, their forms barely visible, but their eyes glinted in the dim light, fixed directly on us. "We need to run," Rachel whispered, her voice trembling. We turned and bolted down the street, our footsteps echoing in the empty silence. I could feel the figures following us, their presence looming closer with every step. The town seemed to stretch on forever, the buildings repeating, the streets looping back on themselves, leading us in circles. No matter where we turned, we couldn't escape them. They were always there, watching, waiting. Finally, we ducked into an alleyway, pressing ourselves against the cold brick wall, our breaths coming in short, panicked gasps. I peered around the corner, expecting to see the figures closing in, but the street was empty. Did we lose them?" Lily asked, her voice barely a whisper. "I don't know," I replied, my heart still racing. "But I don't think we can stay here." Rachel looked at each of us, fear etched into her face. "This town, it's not just weird, it's alive. And it doesn't want us to leave." Marcus shook his head, his jaw clenched. "I don't care what this place is. We're getting out, one way or another." But as we stepped back onto the main street, I felt the weight of Black Hollow pressing down on us, an invisible force that seeped into my bones, my thoughts, my very sense of reality. It was as if the town were alive, a sentient entity determined to keep us within its boundaries. As we moved down the empty streets, the figures appeared once more, shadows blending into the buildings, eyes glinting in the darkness. They didn't chase us, they simply watched, their presence filling the air with a silent threat. We hurried down the street, each step feeling heavier, the shadows growing thicker. The road twisted and turned, leading us deeper into the heart of Black Hollow, until finally, we found ourselves standing in front of an old, decrepit building with a single, flickering sign above the door. Town Records. We might find answers in there, I said, the words slipping out before I could think them through. Marcus looked at me, a mixture of fear and determination in his eyes. Let's go. If this place has secrets, it's time we uncovered them. And with that, we stepped through the door, into the dark, waiting shadows of Black Hollow. The door creaked as we stepped into the dim, stale air of the old Town Records building. Dust hung thick in the air, and shelves lined the walls, crammed with brittle papers and old, faded books. The faint glow of a single, flickering bulb cast long shadows, making the room feel smaller, as if it were closing in around us. "This place gives me the creeps," Lily whispered, her eyes darting around. We moved toward a desk in the center, piled high with files labeled with dates going back decades. I picked up a yellowed folder labeled Missing Persons and opened it, my stomach twisting as I read the names, dozens of them, strangers just like us. "Look at this," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. The others gathered around, scanning the files. Each document was nearly identical, names, dates, descriptions of people who had passed through Black Hollow, and never left. It felt like reading our own future. "It's like they're trapped here," Marcus muttered, flipping through page after page. "And no one knows where they went." Rachel was silent, her face pale. She pulled a smaller file from the pile, labeled Visitors. Inside, a single, handwritten note read, "The town remembers all who enter." I felt a chill crawl down my spine. So, this isn't just coincidence. This town, it's holding on to people. The silence was broken by the soft sound of footsteps just outside. We froze, eyes wide, each of us straining to hear. The footsteps grew louder, drawing closer to the door. "We need to get out of here," I whispered, feeling the cold grip of fear tighten around me. But as we turned to leave, we heard a whisper, low and hollow, echoing from the shelves, "Stay, forever." We bolted out the door, back into the empty streets, our footsteps echoing in the silence. The shadows seemed to move with us, lurking, waiting. As we ran, I felt the weight of the town pressing down, a silent demand that grew stronger with every step. We had uncovered Black Hollow's secret, now, it felt, there was no way it would let us go. We stumbled out of the Town Records building, breaths ragged, the chilling whisper echoing in our minds. The street outside was darker than before, and the air felt thick, heavy. Every shadow seemed sharper, like it was watching us, waiting. "Let's get back to the truck," Marcus said, his voice tight with panic. He didn't wait for an answer, taking off down the street, with the rest of us close behind. As we neared the gas station, a familiar figure stepped out from the shadows. It was the old man, the one who'd warned us in the diner. His expression was grim, his gaze fixed on us with an almost sorrowful intensity. "You went looking where you shouldn't," he said, voice low and hollow. "The town don't take kindly to that. Just tell us how to leave." Rachel shouted, desperation breaking through her usual confidence. "There has to be a way out." The man looked at her, then at each of us in turn, his eyes dark and unreadable. "You can't just leave," he replied, his voice a hoarse whisper. "Black Hollow chooses who stays, and who goes." The words hit me like a punch, a sinking realization taking root. "So, there's no way out?" I asked, struggling to keep the fear out of my voice. The man's gaze softened, but he shook his head. "Maybe, if you go to the chapel. It's where they say the town's heart beats. Sometimes, it shows mercy." "Where's the chapel?" Marcus demanded, a mix of anger and desperation on his face. The old man pointed down a narrow, tree-lined path that wound deeper into the town. "But be warned," he said. Once you step foot there, there's no going back. Black Hollow don't let go so easy. We had no choice. With one last look at the man, we turned and started down the path, the oppressive silence pressing in from all sides. The trees loomed overhead, their twisted branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. The air grew colder with every step, and a low, unsettling hum filled the night, seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere. The chapel appeared suddenly, emerging from the darkness like something out of a nightmare. It was old, the wood warped and splintered, its steeple twisted and leaning precariously to one side. A single light flickered inside, casting a faint glow through the broken windows. "This place doesn't feel right," Lily whispered, clutching my arm. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with fear. But we had come this far, and turning back now wasn't an option. I pushed the door open, and we stepped inside. The chapel was empty, save for a single, dusty altar at the front. Candles lined the walls, their flames flickering in an unseen breeze. Symbols were scrawled across the floor in faded chalk, strange designs that seemed to pulse with a dark energy. We stood there, silent and unsure, until Rachel spoke, her voice barely a whisper. "What do we do now?" Before anyone could answer, the door slammed shut behind us, and the temperature dropped sharply. The candles flickered wildly, casting shadows that twisted and writhed along the walls. Then, a low voice echoed through the chapel, hollow and inhuman. "You entered Black Hollow uninvited, now, you belong to it." The shadows gathered at the edges of the room, coalescing into dark, indistinct figures. They moved slowly, advancing toward us, their eyes glinting with a malevolent hunger. "Run!" I shouted, grabbing Lily's hand as we bolted toward the door. But as we reached it, the shadows closed in, blocking our way, their presence heavy and suffocating. I could feel their cold breath on my skin, the weight of their gaze pressing down on me. "Please," Rachel whispered, her voice trembling. "We didn't mean to, we just want to go home." The voice responded, a mocking tone in its dark whisper. "There is no home beyond Black Hollow, only the darkness." Desperation surged through me, and I turned to the altar, the symbols on the floor drawing my attention. Something about them felt familiar, like I'd seen them before. I knelt down, tracing the lines with my fingers, feeling a faint warmth pulse from the faded chalk. "Do you guys see this?" I asked, motioning to the symbols. Marcus nodded, eyes wide. "It looks like some kind of ritual, maybe to appease whatever's keeping us here." Without waiting for confirmation, I pressed my hand against the center symbol, hoping against hope that it would do something, anything, to help us. The warmth grew stronger, spreading up my arm and filling me with a strange sense of calm, as if the town itself were acknowledging our plea. The shadows halted, their movements slowing as they watched us with cold, unfeeling eyes. The air thickened, a pressure building around us, and for a moment, I thought we were done for. Then, as suddenly as it had started, the feeling lifted. The shadows dissipated, melting back into the corners of the room, leaving us alone in the silence. The voice spoke one last time, softer now, almost satisfied. "Leave, while you still can. Black Hollow remembers, but it grants mercy, just once." Without hesitation, we bolted from the chapel, not daring to look back. The path seemed shorter this time, as if the town itself was guiding us out. We reached the truck, and Marcus didn't waste a second, starting the engine with a roar. As we sped down the road, I glanced back at Black Hollow, its dark shape fading into the night. The weight lifted from my chest, but a part of me knew I'd never really escape that place, that a piece of me would always be trapped there, lingering in the shadows of Black Hollow. We didn't stop driving until the first light of dawn touched the horizon. The road stretched ahead, finally clear, with no sign of the twisted shadows that had followed us through Black Hollow. Exhaustion hit me hard, but the adrenaline hadn't left, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something still wasn't right. Rachel glanced back at the fading town, her face pale and drawn. Do you think we're really out?" Of course we are, Marcus said, gripping the wheel tighter, but I could hear the uncertainty in his voice. We're out, we're safe. That's all that matters. But as I looked around the truck, I could tell that no one fully believed it. Lily was clutching her phone, her fingers shaking as she tried to get a signal. Every now and then, she'd look out the window, her eyes darting from one shadow to the next. Lily, I said softly, it's over. We're okay. She looked at me, her eyes filled with something between fear and disbelief. Are we, though? She whispered. That place, it's not just a town. It's alive, like it has its own memory. I feel like it let us go, but not entirely. The words sent a chill through me, but I tried to brush it off. We were miles away now. Surely, we'd left Black Hollow behind. We pulled into a rest stop to catch our breath, grabbing coffee and trying to shake off the night's events. The other travelers around us looked relaxed, normal, nothing like the shadowed faces we'd seen in that haunted town. For a moment, the warmth of the sun and the smell of fresh coffee almost made me believe we were back to normal. Almost. As we sipped our drinks, a strange silence fell over our table. No one spoke, each of us lost in our own thoughts. Finally, Rachel broke the silence. I keep thinking about that old man, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. What he said about Black Hollow, that it remembers everyone who enters. Marcus scoffed, though his laugh sounded hollow. Just small-town scare tactics. He was trying to freak us out, and he did a damn good job. But even as he spoke, I could see the doubt in his eyes. None of us were truly convinced that we had escaped unscathed. Lily suddenly reached into her bag, pulling out the map we'd used to navigate. She unfolded it on the table, her eyes scanning the paper with growing confusion. What's wrong? I asked, leaning over to look. It's Black Hollow isn't on here, she murmured, tracing her finger over the area where we should have found it. We passed through the mountains here, took this road here, but the town isn't marked. It's like it doesn't exist. My stomach twisted. That doesn't make sense. We were there. We saw it. Lily shook her head, her expression unreadable. Maybe we did. Or maybe, it's just a place that only exists when it wants to. Her words lingered, a dark reminder of everything we'd experienced. I tried to brush it off, but a nagging doubt crept into my mind. Could it be true? Could Black Hollow simply disappear? We packed up and headed back to the truck, eager to leave the rest stop and put as much distance as possible between us and the memory of that night. But as Marcus started the engine, I noticed something strange, something that made my heart skip a beat. Carved into the dust on the back window were two words, "Come back." I stared, my mind racing. Guys, look. They turned, and the color drained from Rachel's face as she read the message. No. No, this can't be happening, she whispered, clutching her arms. Lily reached out, brushing her fingers across the words, as if testing if they were real. Someone's playing a trick on us, she said, though she sounded far from convinced. But deep down, I knew the truth. Black Hollow wasn't done with us. It had let us leave, but it hadn't let us go. As we drove away, I glanced back one last time, half expecting to see the town looming in the distance. Instead, there was nothing, only the endless stretch of road behind us, as if Black Hollow had never existed at all. But as the sun rose higher, casting shadows across the road, I felt a cold presence settle in the pit of my stomach. I knew that wherever we went, whatever we did, Black Hollow would be watching, waiting. And that, someday, it would call us back. For now, we were free. But the memory of Black Hollow lingered, a shadow in our minds, haunting us. Because the town had a way of holding on. It always remembered. And somewhere, in the quiet darkness, it waited.